This is a commissioned piece. A friend of mine asked me if I would do a bowl for his wife's birthday. And I thought it would be nice to do a segmented piece with a pattern that had a little bit more of a personal connection than just doing a solid wood-turned bowl. So I asked if there was something that I could make into a pattern for the bowl, and he came back with an L and a $, because this is her nickname. So the L was easy enough to translate into a segmented pattern, but the $, was, at first seemed like a little bit more of a challenge, but I came up with a series of triangles and 2 cut-off rectangles that formed an abstracted $, next to the L. Then I repeated the L on the other side, and that gave me a symmetrical pattern that actually worked pretty well. So I started by getting the wood I was going to use ready, which was walnut for the darker wood and maple for the lighter wood. Before I got into the angled cuts I was going to do, I've been meaning for quite a while to make a handle for the table saw. The wheel that angles the blade is missing the little handle, so it's hard to turn. So I turned a quick walnut handle out of a piece of scrap walnut that I had. I found there's no threading in the hand wheel, but I could use a bolt to hold the handle on, with a nut on the inside of the handle. So I started by working on the inside of the pattern, making the triangular pieces for the S. And the first 2 triangles were a little bit of a challenge to clamp, but I found if I clamped them together and then used tape to hold the tops of the triangles together, that seemed to work. Then I made the seamed face flush, the table saw, and then carefully jointed that face on the jointer, as this was the face I was going to glue to the cut-off rectangle that this piece was going to get glued to. And that went together. And that was really the hardest part of the gluing. So I trimmed up the ends on that. And then from there I could make the tails on the L, which was an easy clamp to the previous rectangle. So you can see how that pattern is coming along. Then I jointed the faces of that piece, because I was going to have to glue that to itself to make a symmetrical pattern. Next I worked on the vertical parts of the L and the walnut spacer that I had between each replicating part of the pattern. You can see how it goes together now. So it was a matter of gluing all these pieces together. I worked out a system where I'd glue one joint together, clamp it, and then as that was setting up, I'd put the glue on the next piece and then open the clamps up and slide the next piece in, and then clamp that together and then add glue to the next piece. So I sort of had a little system going. I didn't have all the joints to glue all at once and then trying to hold them all together all at once. And then once they were all together, I just filled it in with clamps and took it apart, and it glued a little bit to the clamp with a lot of glue coming out. So I scraped that off. Then I could joint the top and bottom to that piece. Next I had to cut this piece that I'd made into a bunch of little segments, which would become the segments for the bowl. So I cut those at 1.5 inches in length, which gave me a rough bowl thickness of 1.5 inches. I cut out 12 as I was going to make a 12 segmented bowl, which meant a 15-degree angle on each side of these segments. So I changed jigs and cut each side at a 15-degree angle. So it makes a bunch of parts to an arch. If you think of an arch and the stones that go into an arch, that's what I was making, except this would make a complete circle. Now in gluing this up, I'm usually not absolutely perfect with the angle, so that I end up with a gap within the 360 degrees. So I'll glue half at a time and put a little shim in on the 2 halves. Once the decorative ring was glued up, I could start working on the walnut pieces that would make up the rest of the bowl. So I got those pieces ready by first cutting them to length on the radial arm saw. And then joining an edge and a face on the jointer. And then planing the opposing face on the planer to make the thickness the same all the way through each piece. And then cutting strips of 1.5 inch width on the tip saw. Then from there, I could make pieces with a 15-degree angle on each side. And these varied in length for each ring so that the rings would get smaller as they go down the bowl. Now, when I cut the angle with this method on the table saw, I was lucky and the angles actually for once worked out perfectly. So I didn't have to do the trick where I glue half the ring up. It worked out complete as a circle, so I could glue it all together at once. And this saved a step. So I had to take the decorative ring and sand the two halves to make them go together perfectly, and then glue them a second time into a complete ring. Then I started to think about how the rings were going to go together. And I wanted to make a bottom for the bowl. I found it's a little easier to do this with 4 big pieces, as I can make the 4 corners come together perfectly in the center. And I drew a circle on this bottom piece so that I could cut off the extra and cut it into a circle, which will help on the lathe. It means that there's less material to remove on the lathe. Then I sanded each ring on its face so that they would go together without any gaps between each ring. And the disander works well for this. It gives you a nice flat surface. Now in the past, when I've glued up a bowl like this, I've tried to glue all the rings at once. And without a jig to hold them all in place, they tend to slide around, and it's really hard to hold them together nice and evenly. So this time I glued 2 and 3 rings together at a time and let those set up for about 20 minutes or so, and then glued those sections together. This took a little bit longer, but it was much more accurate and a lot less nerve-wracking. The last piece to go on was the tenon for the chuck. And it was going to be difficult to use the clamps to clamp this in place, as they don't really reach into the center of the bowl. So I mounted the bowl on the lathe and then used the tailstock to hold this tenon piece in place while the glue dried. And I checked to see whether the chuck jaws were going to fit around it. So the next morning, once the glue was dry, the first thing to do was to turn that tenon down into a perfect circle so it would fit into the jaws of the chuck nicely. Then I started turning the bowl. I started on the outside to find the shape of the bowl that I had made. I know there's lots of software and there's lots of ways to get real precise with the little segments of the bowl, but I tend to just kind of cut them out and glue them together and then find the bowl that's within that shape. I really just need to make sure that there's enough material there. Then I worked on the inside, and it turned out in the end that there was plenty of material there to make a nice shape. I finished it up with a scraper, which gives a better surface than the gouge. Nice fluffy lathe shavings there. And I sanded. And I actually got it pretty smooth with this scraper, so I didn't have to do a whole lot of sanding on it. Then I turned off the tenon and made the bottom of the bowl. And sanded the bottom. Then I put finish on. And I used the linseed oil beeswax mix that I have. And I put it on thick at first, let it sit for about an hour, and then come back with a clean cloth and wipe off the excess and kind of rub the bowl a little bit. Then let it sit for another 12 hours or so, and then kind of rub the finish into the wood. And it makes a sort of a nice, just a little bit of gloss, but a fairly matte finish I really like. And that's how it turned out. Hi. So I found another walnut bowl. I think it's about time to do some more turning. It should be kind of fun. This one I did several years ago, and I think it's pretty well dried. You can see how warped it is, and it's actually kind of compressed in one direction more than the other. I think it's 13 inches this way and 14 inches this way. So, but it should turn okay. This one hasn't cracked at all, so I could just turn it the way it is. But what I'm thinking I'd like to do is to put a lip on it with a segmented pattern around the top. I thought that'd be kind of nice because it's a little bit of a flat bowl. I mean, that'd be okay the way it is, but it would be fun to do some kind of mixing where it's a solid piece and then some segmented patterns. be kind of neat. So we'll do that. What I wanted to do with the pattern was to have the darker wood of the bowl and a lighter wood of the rim kind of mixed together. So some sort of crenellated pattern or sort of zigzag pattern or something like that. The vision that I kept having was some kind of zigzaggy pattern. What I ended up with was a system of 2 points per segment and then a wider space of light wood between each segment. In doing these segments, I wanted them to work where I wouldn't be turning end grain. I think in the past, when I've made a pattern of segments, I've made basically a sausage, a long strip of wood that has the pattern within it, and then from that I slice off the pieces that I need. But in doing this, I made each segment separately so that I could have the grain running with the circumference of the bowl. Now, in doing the little walnut pieces, I could just cut all of those because they had the same angle on each side. But for the 2 pieces of birch on each side of the segment, I had to cut the angled side and a vertical side. So I set up one saw with an angle on it, and then I could walk around to the other saw and cut the vertical piece. So it was a lot of back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth kind of a thing to do all 12 segments. But of course I needed 2 sides, so I needed 24 of these pieces. And then once I had all the pieces cut, they went together like this. And I thought I was going to have some problems clamping these because of the angle, and the glue would sort of be like a lubricant in there, and I would clamp it and the pieces would slide around. That ended up, I think my angle was steep enough that I could just clamp the 2 ends on pretty much all of them, and it worked just fine. So this is the first one, and I tried clamping the end and then kind of clamping it down to the table so it wouldn't slide around. But what I found was I didn't really have to do this second clamp. I could just clamp the ends, and it worked just fine. So those are the clamps coming off, and then I have all my segments made. I sanded the front and back so that I could set them on my sled again to cut the angle to make the segments fit into a ring. So I have 12 segments, which works into 30 degrees of angle that I need on each segment. So each side needs a 15-degree angle. And I made the segments for a solid ring as well that'll go on top. So this is how the segments go together. And for gluing, I found instead of trying to spread the glue, I could just kind of put a blob of glue on and then kind of massage the pieces together. And that worked well. And it was quicker than being finicky with each piece. There's the pattern ring glued up. And then I'll do the solid ring, and it's the same process of gluing that up. So now I have the 2 rings glued, and you can see how they're going to go on. The pattern ring is upside down in this shot, but you get the idea. Next I had to flatten out the rim of the bowl so that I could glue the rings to the bowl. So I put the faceplate on the back on the bowl again, trying to find the center. And it was just a matter of flattening out the rim, which was pretty warped. So I got that as flat as I could on the lathe, and then I put it on the disc sander to get the surface parallel to itself so that the rings would glue to it nice and flat. And I sanded the rings. Once those were ready, I could glue everything together. And I got a nice even layer of glue between the rings and between the bowl. For clamping this, what I found I can do is cut a piece of wood that's the height of the whole system and a piece of wood that's the width of my table. Clamp that together, and that little spacer piece allows me to not have to balance 2 clamps at once. And it actually works really well, and it's really easy and super simple. And where I just have 2 glue joints like this, it doesn't slide around too much, so it works just fine. And I could cut off the excess of the rings. I could turn this off, but it's a little quicker just to cut it off in the bandsaw. Now it's time to turn. And you can see how out of round it is. I started by working on the outside, and I got that nice and round. And then I worked on the face, and got that running smooth. And then from there I started working on the inside. Most of this project is in the rim. So I spent a lot of time working on the shape of what the rim was going to be like. And the thought that I had was, because I had a pattern that was kind of pointy and had little sharp bits, I wanted to do a kind of round shape on the actual shape of the rim and the bowl, so that those 2 forms would contrast with each other. So I brought the rim around and kind of towards the inside of the bowl on a gentle curve. And then I smoothed out the inside. It really didn't take a whole lot of turning. I just had to get it round. And then I ran the scraper over everything to get the surface smooth. And it sanded and sanded. I like using the drill with a piece of sandpaper on it because you get a random pattern of sanding on the bowl. And I did some very fine sanding. I think I got up to 600 grit. And I took the faceplate off. Now I need to work on the bottom. So I measured the bowl and I found that I had about 1.25 inches of thickness on the bottom. In the past I've gone too far and made the bottom too thin, so I'm always very careful just to check how thick the bottom is. I realized when I was thinking about how I was going to hold this bowl backwards that the little rubber nubbins on my big chuck weren't going to be able to hold the rim of this bowl, so I was going to have to make some custom brackets to hold the bowl in place while I worked on the bottom. So I copied the shape of the bowl and made 8 brackets to hold the bowl in place. I put it on the lathe, and I realized as I tightened it up that the shape wasn't quite going to work because the part of the curve next to the chuck was actually pushing the bowl away from the chuck. So I cut off that part of the curve and just made a space there so that the brackets, when they get tightened up, would push the bowl against the chuck and make it a lot more firm or steady hold to the bowl, and it wouldn't rattle around like it was. And this actually worked really well. And then I could clean up the bottom. And I kept the tailstock in place just to hold it really well. This is the point at which you've put 3 or 4 days of work into a piece and then it comes flying off the lathe and shatters on the floor. So I tend to be really careful at this point. I made a little indentation in the bottom just so the bowl would sort of sit on a little rim. And I used a scraper on the bottom just to smooth up the surface. And I sanded. And I didn't want to use the turning tools without the tailstock in place, so I used a Forstner bit to drill off the little nubbin where the tailstock was. And I sanded the very inside. And it was all done. I'm ready for a finish. And this one I just used tung oil. And I put the finish on. And with this, I guess you put it, it's sort of similar to the linseed oil. You put it on kind of thick and then you rub it off after a few minutes. It's a little shinier than what I'm used to, but it looks really nice. It doesn't look like there's a thick layer on there. It just looks like it's polished, which is nice. And there we have it. I like how it came out. My wife says it looks like a cat poking its head up over the edge of a table, which I kind of like that idea.